Okay, good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all. I will be stopping, by the way, before I start. I'll be stopping at 9:59 on the dot because we have an important event in the shul at 10 o'clock, which is a speaker speaking about memory and brain exercises and the like. Something very useful and applicable for all of us at the current time in lockdown when perhaps we're not getting our normal stimulation. So. Please make sure you join that also. You can see details on the NAIR calendar. So we were looking at the issue of Das Torah, and in particular the authority granted through the pasuk of Luzzatto. And I think we looked last week at the psukim of Luzzatto and analysed them in depth. This is in Devarim Perek Yozayin, chapter 17. The pasuk is really a lav and a mitzvah saseh. A positive mitzvah to do that which we are commanded to do, and lo sosum in adava sheyagidu lecha yamin or small, not to veer off that which we are commanded, neither right nor left. And we looked at the Rashi, the very famous comment of Rashi. Even if they tell you that right is left and left is right, one should listen to them. And we saw how there were different views in Chazal, a Sifri, a Talmud Yerushalmi, and various other sources that said a softer version, and this explicit sources that said one doesn't listen if they say right is left and left is right. That actually interprets the pasuk to mean only listen if they say right is right and left is left. And we saw various distinctions between these halachas. The question, though, that remains is, why is such authority granted to the Sanhedrin? Particularly if the implication of the pasuk is, even if they get it wrong. And what is the extent of this authority granted? Is it only in mitzvahs and halacha, or even beyond halacha, to the realm of perhaps the political and the like? What is the extent of this rabbinic authority? And finally, who does it apply to? Does it only apply to the Sanhedrin HaGadol in Yerushalayim? Or is it applicable perhaps even nowadays to rabbinic leaders? So to answer this question, I'd like to look at the words of the Rambam, the words of the Sefer HaChinuch, and then try after that to understand the complicated and nuanced stance of the Rambam on this matter. So let's first start off with the Rambam, and I'm actually going to share my screen for a few moments, just because this, if I can find it, because this gives an interesting view. If we can see inside the source, yes, you should be able to see this now. The Rambam is on the pasuk of Yomin or Smol, right and left. And the Rambam starts off by quoting Rashi, Yomin or Smol, Afilu omelacha al Yomin shu Smol or Smol shu Yomin. Even if they say to you that right is left and left is right, Lashon Rashi. He quotes Rashi on this. The inyono, and the idea is, Afilu tachshev belibcha shem toim, even if you think they've made a mistake, and it's obvious to you that they're wrong, nonetheless, one should listen to what they say. Then we get to the second paragraph, which I'll highlight. The need for this mitzvah is very great. On the second paragraph of the Rambam, we only have a written Torah. The implications of how we learn this Torah, it's well known that minds don't always agree. Machlokas argument will increase, and one will end up with multiple Torahs, and one will be unable to arrive at a practical system of how to live. Therefore, halacha determines that we should listen to the Beis Din HaGadol, the Supreme Court, which sits in its seat as chosen by Hashem. Its seat is next to the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, and we should listen to them. Whether what they're telling us is received tradition, generation after generation from Moshe on Sinai, or they interpret psukim. because it's based on their understanding that it was given to us, that the Torah was given to us. Even if it looks like they're switching right to left. How much more so if they're telling us that right is right? And then he says, the Spirit of Hashem rests on those who serve in his Beis HaMikdash, and he won't desert the pious ones. And he will always protect us from mistake and stumbling. So the Ramban, very, very important source, says three things really over here. The first is he assumes this halacha applies only to the Sanhedrin, those who sit on the Temple Mount, which really, as we saw the Psukim in Devarim, is really what the Pasuk says. You should do that which they tell you. Who is this? You should go up to the place which Hashem has chosen, i.e. the Sanhedrin Agadol who sits on the Temple Mount. So this is the first point. The Ramban assumes it's only those who sit on the Temple Mount. The second point is he assumes this only applies to tradition, Masorah, Halacha Moshe Messina, things handed down from Moshe, or things interpreted through the principles of interpretation of Psukim, what's known as the hermeneutical principles, the methods of droshes of Chazal, Gezer Shava and Kal V'chomer, and various types of reason, and so on and so forth. Remember, by the way, that in our last series, when we looked at the extent of the authority, for pure D'Rabbanans, Gezeros and the like, the Rambam, Maimonides, was of the view that the Pasuk of Luzzatto also gave authority to rabbinic inactions. But the Ramban argues, and he said, no, rabbinic inactions, rabbinic innovation isn't included in Luzzatto, only rabbinic interpretation. And this is another example of where the Rambam says this. So this is the second point of the Rambam. The third point the Rambam says is that the reason for this is because you need a system. You need to be able to run society, and society needs a legislative body. Otherwise, how does it function? How do you deal with disagreement? Things are always left to interpretation in any legal system, how much more so in the Torah, which consists of a Torah Shvichsav and a Torah Shebal Peh, and therefore we need someone to decide. And the fourth point the Rambam mentions, which is very unclear what he's saying, he says it won't happen that Hashem will desert his pious ones, Chasidov, and the Ruach of Hashem rests on those who serve him in the Beis HaMikdash, apparently referring here to the Sanhedrin. So this is unclear why the Rambam introduces this fourth and final point. After all, he's already explained as a legal principle that it makes sense to listen to have an authority. But then he adds in, even if what they say doesn't make sense, because Hashem will look after us. So just to unpick a little bit these 4 points of the Rambam, if we think of a spectrum of rabbinic authority, the spectrum can be broadened in 3 directions. It can be broadened in the location of the authority. Is the authority only the Sanhedrin? Or is the authority even other rabbinic leaders? In this respect, the Rambam takes a narrow stance, only Sanhedrin. The second question is the extent of authority. Is the authority only interpretation, even innovation, what we would call gezeros and takonos, or does it even go further to any matters, politics or matters of life, things which aren't strictly within the rabbinic realm? In this respect, the Ramban again takes a narrow stance, and he says it's only interpretation and tradition, not even rabbinic innovation like gezeros and takonos. And then the third question is extent in terms of accuracy. Do we only listen to them when they're right, or even when they're wrong? And why do we listen to them when they're wrong? Is it only legislative, or is it Ruach HaKodesh? And here the Rambam takes a broader stance, and he says it's not just because of reasons of legislative body, but it's also because of some form of trust that we should have in Hashem that the system will work out. So if you remember, when we spoke about Das Torah as a spectrum, we spoke about it as not being one position, but being sort of more drifting towards a particular stance. The particular stance included claims around authority, even nowadays, Rabbanim, claims around a very broad range of authority, the second of our category, even authority outside that which we might think of as halachic, and thirdly, some claim of infallibility. The Rambam does seem to say something around infallibility, but doesn't say anything around the authority being granted even nowadays, outside the realm of the Sanhedrin, and it being anything that's beyond takonos and strict Torah itself. So this is the stance of the Ramban. How the Ramban explains this claim of Ruach HaKodesh is unclear, and why he needs to make it is unclear. He throws it in at the end. After he said that the basis of this pasuk is because you need a legislative body, he then suddenly throws in this idea of Ruach HaKodesh. It's also not clear how it fits the sugyas in Horios that talk about rabbinic mistakes based upon sukkim in the Torah, no less, in Sefer Vayikra, that talks about Asher Nasi Yechta, a Nasi making a mistake. It talks about Pahel on Dover Shul Tzibur, about the whole of Klal Yisrael making a joint mistake due to a mistake of the Sanhedrin. The Gemara talks about Bar Horog Baraglov. What happens if Sanhedrin or Beis Din give a psak that A murdered B, and then B walks in alive, and therefore clearly the ruling was wrong because A couldn't have murdered B because B was still alive. Clearly, I don't know, the witnesses lied or the like. So it's not clear what the Ramban means by this Ruach HaKodesh guarantee, and whether he means genuinely some form of prophetic infallibility, given, as I said, that this doesn't seem to fit Horios and so on, or whether he just means that we shouldn't worry over extensively about mistakes. This is the stance of the Ramban. I want to contrast the Ramban to another important Rishon, and that is the Sefer HaChinuch. Sefer HaChinuch, who wrote a work of halacha and hashkafa, in which he goes through all the mitzvahs in the Torah, all the 613 mitzvahs in the Torah, and analyzes the halachic roles of each of these mitzvahs. The work, by the way, was written anonymously in the 13th century in Spain. He takes the Rambam's count of the mitzvahs, and it's unclear, as I said, who wrote it. It's genuinely thought that it might have been written by someone called Rabbi Aaron Halevi of Barcelona, who was a contemporary of the Rashba, and a very important halachic work, though it remains a little bit unresolved who was the author of this work. Now, the Sefer HaChinuch says 2 points, really. One point is he elaborates on the Ramban's idea that the basis of the authority of the Sanhedrin is because otherwise society would fall apart. Otherwise, we'd remain completely unable to run when there is an argument. Otherwise, how would we know what to do? The second thing, however, he says, is an extension of this halachic authority granted to rabbinic leadership from the Sanhedrin through to contemporary leaders, rabbinic leaders, even post-Sanhedrin, recognized Chachamim in each generation. And in a minute, we'll see the chinuch inside, but the logic of the chinuch stance is simple. If indeed the basis of this mitzvah is to avoid confusion in the halachic process, surely there needs to be the ability to decide halacha even post-Talmud, even post-Sanhedrin, even when we no longer have the supreme Sanhedrin able to advise us. So let's have a look at the Chinuch. By the way, this is just a small extract from the Chinuch. The Chinuch writes at length. He speaks about this twice, this subject, and really says the same thing in each case. He speaks about it in mitzvah Tov Tzadi Hey, which is the positive mitzvah, to listen to that which we commanded, based upon the positive pasuk in Devarim 17, and then in mitzvah Tov Tzadi Vav, he continues this time speaking about the negative commandment, lo sosel, don't deviate from what they say. So for purposes of simplicity, I'm just looking at the negative version of this, the lo saseh, though I could have looked at the positive version equally, and he says similar ideas in both. So I'm just going to share my screen for 1 minute just to give you access to this. And the Chinuch says as follows: Sefer Chinuch mitzvah tzotzav yival shelo lahamris will be based on Gadol Shiyam to Yishnaim al Yisrael, not to ignore what the Beis Din says. And then he summarizes the mitzvah. Shenimlu melachlo kabbalah kabbalah. We shouldn't argue on those who've received the tradition. Umlashanos is devayim, to ignore them, not to listen to them. And then he brings the pasuk in Devarim 17. Lo sasum and adavar sheyagidu chayom and small. Don't deviate from what they say. Then he explains the rationale of the mitzvah. Mishar shei ha-mitzvah, the rationale of the mitzvah. If you should deis b'nei adam chalukim zeh mizeh, no yishtavu le'olam haba deis b'dvarim. People never agree with each other. V'yodea adon ha'kol baruch hu, God knew. She'idu tiyeh kavanos kesuvei ha'torah masur b'yad kol echad v'echad b'nei adam ish lefi ish kefi sichlo. If everyone had the authority to interpret psukim themselves, there would be infinite argument how to understand mitzvahs. The Tasa Torah could come a Torah, we would end up with multiple Torahs rather than one, and that's the basis of the mitzvah. And now he carries on to the part I've put in bold. In every generation, we should listen to the sages who received the words of the previous generations. And they drank the water from their Sephorim. They learnt Torah, they worked hard, day and night, to understand the wonders of their words. Through that, we will arrive at the truth of Torah. If we just follow our own views, then we won't arrive at a good understanding. So the chinuch here, if we think of our three realms of extension of the laws of lo sosor, he extends lo sosor temporally. He extends it beyond the realm of the Sanhedrin to even contemporary Rabbanim. He doesn't extend the authority out of the realm of halacha, though we'll need to look at a little more care at his view on that later. And he doesn't claim Ruach HaKodesh, he doesn't claim rabbinic authority. In fact, he explicitly says in the continuation that the whole logic of this stance is that we need to listen to an authority figure even when they get it wrong. And he cites the story of the Tanur de Be'achanoi that we've looked at extensively previously. So I'll remind you of the story outside, and then we'll look very briefly back at the shared screen just to see the Chinuch say this inside. This is a Gemara in Baba Metzia, who brings an argument between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim, the majority opinion, about the Tanur de Be'achanoi. This was an oven which became tomei and then was dismantled, and there's a whole machlokas there as to what the halachic status of this oven is. And if you remember the story, Rabbi Eliezer is convinced he's right, and he brings a number of miracles to justify this. He says that the walls of the Beis Medrash should prove it, and they begin caving in. The carob tree should prove it, and it moves from its place. The stream should prove it, and it begins flowing different direction. And eventually he says heaven should prove it, and a bus kol comes out and says the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer. And the Chachamim say nothing doing. Lo b'shemaim hi. Torah isn't in heaven. We are going to follow what we do. And then this Gemara carries on and says, Eliyahu says, Nitzchuni bonai nitzchuni. Eliyahu is asked by the Tanaim, what did Hashem say at this time when we ignored the bus kol? And his response was, my children have been victorious over me. In other words, Hashem gives his stamp of approval in this Midrashic Gemara to the ruling of the majority against Rabbi Eliezer, even though the bus kol seem to say that Rabbi Eliezer was correct. Now, we looked at extensively at this Gemara when we learned 2 series back, Torah Shval Peh, and the idea of the Ritzvah, for example, that Torah is multifaceted, that there's nuance, there's different ways of understanding it, and that we partner with Hashem in understanding it. How we hear the words of Torah is a truth of sort, almost a postmodern understanding of truth, in which there's, within limits, there's multiple truths. These and these are the voices of the living God. Shivim Ponim the Torah, 70 faces to Torah, etc., etc. The Chinuch has none of that. The Chinuch says, do you know what's going on in the story? They got it wrong. Rabbi Lezer was right. Rabbi Lezer was correct. The Baskol said that Rabbi Lezer was correct, and that the Chachamim, the majority opinion, was wrong. So why did they follow what they did? Because they didn't understand Rabbi Lezer. They didn't understand his viewpoint. And this is how a legal system has to work. It has to be that there's the possibility of authority. Otherwise you have chaos, as the Chinuch said. Everyone does what they think. And there's no way to have a sustainable Torah. Better to follow the majority, even though you are making a mistake, than follow the minority and end up with chaos. And therefore, nitzchuni bonai nitzchuni, when Hashem says, my sons have been victorious, he means they've beaten me. Because I meant A, and they said B. And they beat me, they're following B against A. And why is that justified? Because the same Torah teaches us, we have to follow the majority opinion. There's a system, you have to have a ruling and a debate. You have to follow the majority, even in a situation where it's wrong. Now, how do we live with ourselves when we've got it wrong? It would be the idea of a greater and lesser evil. Look, it's akin to someone has to break Shabbos to save a life. Now, there are two ways of conceptualizing what happens here. But the simplest way of understanding it is that the person indeed broke Shabbos. They have been Mechal Shabbos. Whatever spiritual harm comes to one from breaking Shabbos has happened in this case. However, they did a greater good. They saved a life. Don't think that you haven't broken Shabbos. You did drive on Shabbos, but you had no choice because you had to save a life, and it was absolutely the correct thing to do. And the person who hesitates to break Shabbos in order to avoid breaking Shabbos, this is a terrible thing. One has to save a life. Of course, that takes precedence. Akin to in a medical case, where God forbid one has to undergo a medical procedure or the like, and it's harmful, it's dangerous, it's unpleasant, it's uncomfortable, it's it does something to one, but it's worth it because overall this restores one to better health. So this is one model of understanding conflicts in halacha. For example, an easy scenario: Shabbos versus saving life. Not that one hasn't broken Shabbos, but one has, and nonetheless it's worth it. Now, the Chinuch seems to be saying a similar model over here. In the Tanur Debei Achonoi, in this argument over the Tahara and Tumah status of the oven, they got it wrong. They have now ended up paskening a mistaken view about this Tanur, and yet it's absolutely the right thing to do because there is a greater good here. Every legal system has to deal with clashes between legal principles, like the clash between life and Shabbos, and it makes sense to follow a system of priorities in the clashes between legal principles, between perhaps the truth of the oven versus needing a court system in which not everyone can take the law into their own hands. Otherwise, it descends into chaos, as perhaps we've seen even in recent weeks. It's worth bowing to the system and following it in order to allow society to function. So this is the Chinuch's view. He is not extending rabbinic authority to anything remotely close to infallibility, and not even to what we saw when we learned Torah Sheba'al Peh of a sort of multiple truth type model. So I just want to share the screen, just a very brief look at these few lines in the Chinuch, and then we will pause a moment to try and digest all of this. So here we have the Chinuch up, and I'll just highlight the paragraph where he talks about Tanur Debei Achonoi. It's near the bottom of the page that you should be able to see. V'al derech inyan zeh, based on this subject, I'll explain to you one medrash, and then he quotes the story of Maisa, the second line in the highlighted section, who Maisa Rabbi Lezer, but Tanur Shalachonoi, Hamutamas Kol Shomer. It's a story that confuses anyone who hears it. And then he brings the story over there, and he says, that which they said, my sons have beaten me. Hashem responded by my sons have beaten me. Of course, we can't beat HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The explanation is exactly as we've discussed. In the argument between Rabbi Lezer and Chaveirov, and now comes the shocking word, Emes ki hoya k'Rabbi Lezer. Of course, the truth was like Rabbi Lezer and like the Baskol, the heavenly voice that came out. Even though the truth was his him, the Yisrim Pilpula al Chaveirov, due to the depth of his reasoning more than that of his friends, his colleagues. They couldn't understand him, and therefore they were unable to admit to him even after the Baskol. And therefore, they followed the general rule. We should follow the majority principle, whether right or wrong. And this is what Hashem replied, therefore, nitzchuni bonai. So this source is telling us very explicitly in the Chinuch, one of the Gedolim Rishonim, that they got it wrong, and nonetheless, the concept of following the majority makes sense. So here we have two very different stances in the Rishonim. Interestingly, each of them extends rabbinic authority in a different way. And I have a suggestion to make on this. I don't have any evidence for the suggestion, but a suggestion to make. The Rambam, who drifts towards this sort of Ruach HaKodesh infallibility model, seems to limit this authority only to the Sanhedrin, only to the Supreme Court, sitting in the Beis HaMikdash. The Chinuch, who definitely doesn't adopt anything remotely like infallibility, is absolutely open about acknowledging rabbinic error, and just believes this is a matter of system, extends the authority even to contemporary rabbinic leaders, every generation to its senior poskim. Now, I think the two might be in a scale against each other. Meaning to say, if you're going to grant infallibility, the limit has to be to what the Pasuk says, to the Sanhedrin in the Beis HaMikdash, who there are in the center of the center of the Jewish world, the center of the Beis HaMikdash. They're able to discuss things together. They have authority over the whole of Klal Yisrael. Therefore, they're granted this. The Ramban at least is of the view that's an infallibility. Now, one can't extend that to contemporary rabbinic pasak, and explicitly he doesn't, because this is something granted, as he says, to those who are in the Beis HaMikdash. This is granted to the one rabbinic authority. What would happen if you extended it to the modern day, when you have a Rashi arguing with the Tosfos, or a Rav Elyashiv arguing with the Ramosha Feinstein? How would this apply? The Chinuch, on the other hand, who extends this to, who views this as a purely legal principle that a society needs final decision makers, so he extends this to even contemporary Pesach, because the basis of this is solely that of the functioning of society. Then it makes sense to extend it to even post-Sanhedrin era. This is a suggestion, possibly, as to what the debate is between the two. But interestingly, we have no source that extends infallibility to contemporary rabbinic leadership. If you adopt the infallibility stance, it would only be the Sanhedrin. If you adopt the practical stance, then possibly one could extend infallibility. Now, I've had a number of questions in the chat, which I'll just have to have a look at. The first question was, we have a principle that a gezerah made by the Chachamim that cannot be upheld by the tzibur. How does that sit with the Rambam then? I will get to that. So the role of communal acceptance in rabbinic authority is the next thing we will have a look at today, because it's very closely allied with the view of the Rambam, Maimonides, that we haven't yet got to. So far we've seen the view of Rambam, Nachmanides, and the view of the Chinuch, but we haven't yet seen the view of the Rambam. And once we've seen the view of the Rambam, we will look at the role of communal acceptance in this area. Someone else wrote, they've heard Rabbanim say that the main paskin shayla of a congregant, they receive a type of Ruach HaKodesh from paskining. They also add that this is why they won't answer purely hypothetical shayla. Because I asked, based on what I've said, if I would agree with this concept. Okay, so every Rav who paskins experiences a difference between paskining for a hypothetical shayla and an actual shayla. So many rabbinic colleagues I've spoken to over the years have experienced this, and this is certainly something that I have experienced myself also. Now, to claim that this is Ruach HaKodesh is not a claim that I would even dream remotely of making about myself. I can't speak for my rabbinic colleagues and their experiences. However, in my mind, I've explained this in a number of ways, and this is really, really common in Pesach. There's no doubt that, at least psychologically, when you're dealing with a real life case, you think about it differently to hypothetically, number one. And number two, Pesach is nuanced to circumstances, such that there's no doubt when you have a real live person speaking to you, you think about the Shaila differently. Pesach is also nuanced, it's human-centric, and there's no doubt it varies based upon the person who is speaking to one. And again, therefore, when one speaks to a real live person, the Pesach is different because you know the context, you know the backgrounds, you know the family circumstances, you know the realm of other shaylas have asked, and you build up a holistic picture of how they ask questions and in what way, and you definitely get a better Pesach because you know about missing information that might be there, you know about sensitivities that might be there, family circumstances. Clearly, for example, one would give a different Pesach in kashrus to a 15-year-old Baal Teshuvah living at home with parents who don't keep halacha and they want to keep halacha and they have a shayla about kashrus in their kitchen to someone who's running their own home. So many different circumstances would make a difference around the questions. There's no doubt when you know who's asking, it is a better Pesach. I should mention I volunteer for one of the popular shayla texts, one of the popular helplines where people can ask questions. And the questions are anonymous. And I always hope that the people anonymously asking the questions are not congregants. I always hope they would come directly to me, because there's no doubt I can give a better Pesach when I know who is who's asking the shayla. So both of these are very rational explanations without coming on to any claim of Ruach HaKodesh. Having said that, there is a concept of siyata d'shmaya, of divine assistance, and I don't think that's the same as Ruach HaKodesh. But it is possible that when a community depends upon one, one has ability to investigate matters in an assisted manner in which one receives heavenly assistance. That is certainly a possibility. And again, in my very limited rabbinic career, there are cases where a real shayla comes up that is very, very difficult and very hard to paskin, and perhaps it's a circumstance where one can't turn to greater authority for whatever reason, and one has incredible siyata d'shmaya in such situations. At the beginning of Corona, for example, there were literally life and death shaylas that were arriving at my table, end of life shaylas, which normally one would need a great deal of yishav hadas and often consultation with great poskim. These are life and death shaylas; they're not to be treated trivially, and it was simply impossible. The pressure at the time was extraordinary. This was before Pesach. And there was no access to the Gedolim poskim. They were overwhelmed themselves, and one had to paskin. And as a very junior Rav, I was with very limited knowledge. I was having to paskin shaylas that really need to go to Gedolim poskim. And Baruch Hashem, with Siyata Shmaya, I managed. And afterwards, when I had the time and the ability to look into it and speak and so on, there were situations which were just one was called upon to do things that are beyond really one's abilities. Many years ago, actually, I'll just share the story because it's an interesting story. I was a scholar in residence. My wife and I were scholars in residence at a Shabbaton of one of the large Kiruv organizations. And Shabbos morning, the caterer began serving lunch, and he opened the cholent, and in the cholent he had put, wrapped in silver foil, kishka logs as part of the cholent that he was going to serve. He unwrapped the first kishka log and discovered that instead of putting a kishka log into the cholent, he had put a gefilte fish log into the cholent. So this is a terrible shayla. Does the whole Shabbaton now have to go without cholent because of this fish and meat mixture that has been cooked together? And we know, for reasons that aren't entirely clear, in halacha we don't eat fish and meat cooked together. So this shayla came to my table. And I was there with a very difficult and unusual shayla. This isn't an everyday shayla at all. So there's a lot of factors. The cooking of the fish and milk together, the ratios of the contents, the fact that it was wrapped, the fact that this is a massive need, this is a Shabbos, this is a large number of people, I think 200 plus people there, and significant loss, a lot of different factors to paskin, and no access to any foreign. I was away in this hotel. I didn't have a single halachic work with me. I think we had Siddurim and Chumash, and that was pretty much it. And I was the only Rav present to paskin. Anyway, so I gave a psak, and I said that this was okay for various pieces of reasoning. And the caterer, who was a caterer under a certain hechsher, said to me, "This is a terrible psak. You know, I don't believe my licensing authority would give this psak." So I said to him, is this event under the licensing authority, or are you just a licensed caterer who are providing food to this event? And it turns out it's the latter. So I said, look, in that case, I don't care what your licensing authority said. This is the psak, I'm the Rav present. This is what I'm saying. Now, this was a very, very difficult shaila. I was then, so the Shabbaton was over, and we went back to our regular life. And a few weeks later, I got a letter from a very upset rabbinic authority against my psak. So I'm now in trouble, right? I've got a senior, kashrus organization upset with what I had said. So I had my argument and my reasonings, but at the end of the day, reasoning is reasoning. Anyway, I went to shul for mincha, and there was a new sefer lying around that I had never seen before, and I picked it up and began browsing through it. I opened it on a page, and there's a footnote at the bottom of the page, in which it brings a story that happened to Rabbi Chachamim of Lublin, an identical story. I kid you not. On the Shabbos, where exactly the shaila came up, the cholent had been mixed with fish. And there was this teshuvah from Rabbi Chachamim of Lublin. And he said, Baruch Hashem, exactly my halachic reasoning, and came to the same psak. So instead of me having to argue over points of svara, and I would say this, and the base would say this, and would each become hardened in their position because they're taking a different stance, I simply wrote back in response, see this teshuvah of Rabbi Chachamim of Lublin, and I never heard back from this particular kashrus authority, Baruch Hashem. So occasionally one sees the Yata D'Shmaya. But in direct answer to your question, I don't think anyone should call this Ruach HaKodesh. I don't believe that one. I can't comment for the great poskim, but I think on a regular level, one should be careful to make claims of Ruach HaKodesh. But occasionally, perhaps one has hashgacha pratis when one is given Siyata D'Shmaya. And if someone just texted to me, the brach of Atachonin Adam Dasim and Hamed Leno Shbina. Of course, we believe in Siyata D'Shmaya. Of course, we believe HaKadosh Baruch Hu helps us. He grants us everything, as we say in Amida every day. He grants us health. He grants us panasa, and certainly Atachonin Adam Das. He gives us the free gift of das, of minds that can reason. So Siyata D'Shmaya should not be a controversial idea. Ruach HaKodesh granted to psak is a more difficult idea. Finally, a couple of other comments that were posted over here. Someone wrote there's a very Hobsonian view of the chinuch, referencing Thomas Hobbes, one of the political philosophers. I mean, absolutely, yes. This is a lot of political philosophy is around these ideas of a need for a system, otherwise we descend into chaos. Absolutely. Finally, I was asked in the chat, according to the chinuch, do we go after majority Rabbinic opinion? Absolutely. However, how this would be applied to contemporary situation would be difficult. And we'll talk about this later also. So we're not really yet discussing in great depth contemporary application of all of this. How do we decide who the contemporary post come on? How does that work? But the chinuch says that in the context of the Sanhedrin, Achrei Rabbim Lahatos, and similarly, even in a post-Sanhedrin scenario. So the story of Tanur de Be'achanoi, it doesn't take place in the Sanhedrin, it takes place in the Beis HaMedrash. There's a debate there amongst the Rabbanim, and Chachamim, the psak is like the Chachamim. So we're now talking about a Mishnaic era debate, not a debate at the times of the Sanhedrin. And nonetheless, the psak follows the majority opinion there in the Beis HaMedrash, not that of the minority, not that of Rabbi Lezer. So certainly the chinuch would be of the view that we follow the majority principle, though how this is applied nowadays is a little more complex. So just to summarize so far, we've come to 55, so I think I will conclude with this, and next week we will start with the Rambam, because the Rambam needs its whole extensive analysis. Last week we looked at the pasuk of Luzzatto, which certainly grants rabbinic authority, both the mitzvahs aseh and the mitzvahs lo aseh. And even when we are at least somewhat convinced they have made a mistake, we got into the discussions last week of the nuances, the difference between Rashi and the Sifri and the Yerushalmi, about what degree of mistake and what extent of authority is granted to argue. But certainly this is a source for authority. There's no doubt about that. What is the extent of the authority? What's the reason for this authority? Rambam legal system, otherwise society falls apart, plus Siyata D'Shmaya, plus Ruach HaKodesh of sorts rather, limited to the Sanhedrin. Chinuch extends it to contemporary times, but takes a very practical view of this and is explicit that this is even in a case where there's a mistake, And mistakes can happen even to the greatest of the great. It's an astonishing chinuch. He's talking about a Mishnah. He's talking about something that enters into the halacha. We paskin like the majority opinion against Rabbi Lezer, even though we know they got it wrong, because this is what they thought and this is what the majority understood, and that's how legal systems have to operate. In Mitzvah Hashem, next week we will look at the Rambam. We will look at the Rambam's view on the matter, and we will also get to the question that I was asked about how this applies to the community. What role is communal acceptance have in rabbinic authority? So we'll stop there, and I wish everyone a good day. And again, a quick plug for the memory event, which is taking place next at 10 o'clock. I'll also mention that on Monday evening, tomorrow night, I'm giving a share on the halachas of vaccination. Very, very interesting halachic topic of thank God, the amazing the amazing innovations around vaccination. And I'll give a share on that topic on Monday. I wish you all a good day.
Rabbi, how are you?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.